Picture this. I pull up to my grandfather's lakeside cabin, the place he built with his bare hands in 1956, and instead of quiet water and weathered logs, I see some unemployed 20-something and his tattooed girlfriend sprawled on the front porch, greasy takeout containers balanced on my grandfather's railing. The guy smirks at me and says, "Sorry, man, this is ours now." That's how I found out my grandfather's cabin had been sold at a sheriff's sale I never even knew existed. My grandfather, Henry Hank Callahan, was a Korean War vet who came home, decided he was done taking orders, bought 5 acres on Silver Mist Lake for $800, and built his own world out there. You could smell the pine sap in the hand-cut logs, hear the lake lapping against the dock he'd built, and feel every stone he'd laid into the fireplace. These days the place is worth around $400,000, but to me it was simple. That cabin was him. On paper, the land sits inside Evergreen Bluffs HOA, but Hank's cabin predated that HOA by decades. When they formed in the 90s, his place was officially exempt, grandfathered in, supposedly beyond their reach. Then Elaine Rockwell decided the rules didn't apply to her. Imagine every HOA nightmare rolled into one woman. Perfectly sprayed gray bob, real estate agent blazer, voice that could cut glass, and a smile that made kids step behind their moms. She'd run Evergreen Bluffs like a private kingdom for 12 years, specializing in inherited properties, especially military families and people with wrong last names. We're usually out of town, juggling funerals and hospital visits, not camped out at the courthouse. She knew that. Her golden child was Dylan Rockwell, 30% criminal, 70% mama's boy, 28, unemployed, and still sleeping under superhero posters in his childhood bedroom. Rap sheet full of petty theft and drugs. The kind of guy who borrows your lawn mower, sells it online, then acts offended when you ask for it back. The first shot landed while I was in Ohio helping my mom after hip surgery. A certified letter arrived at the cabin, $15,000 in retroactive landscaping assessments for work I'd never seen, requested, or approved. Pay in 30 days or face a lien. I thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. Suddenly, I was getting daily violation notices. Grass half an inch too long. Mailbox the wrong shade of black. Suspicious late-night activity because my army buddies drove pickups. Meanwhile, Elaine was knocking on doors, whispering that the unstable vet in Hank's cabin was bad for property values. The waves stopped. Conversations died when I walked up. Overnight, I went from Hank's grandson to problem. 3 weeks later, she dropped the hammer. A lien for $23,000 in fees, fines, and interest, and a sheriff's sale scheduled 30 days out. To the county, I was just another delinquent homeowner. To Elaine, I was a target she'd been circling for years. I spent a week knee-deep in public records and realized this wasn't her first rodeo. Over 5 years, Elaine had quietly funneled 3 distressed properties to relatives at bargain basement prices. Lakefront worth $200,000 to her brother-in-law for $60,000. Corner lot for half its value. It wasn't community protection. It was organized theft with letterhead. I hired Olivia Ramirez, an HOA attorney known for making corrupt boards cry, and filed a complaint with the State Real Estate Commission. That was my first real punch. Her counterpunch was brutal. An emergency HOA meeting that moved my sheriff's sale up to 2 weeks, and a buried legal notice in a tiny weekly paper no one reads. On sale day, exactly 3 people showed up. Elaine, a guy in a cheap suit smelling like old cigarettes, and Dylan, looking like he'd just rolled out of bed. Cheap suit opened at $20,000. Dylan bumped it to $24,000. Silence. Sold. Just like that, my grandfather's $400,000 cabin belonged to Elaine's son for $24,000. Within an hour, Dylan and his girlfriend were dragging in trash bags full of clothes and a stolen shopping cart full of junk, turning Hank's cabin into a flop house. Olivia moved fast, found that the sale notice wasn't legally published, and filed an injunction. For one day, it felt like we might have them. Then a courier showed up with a manila envelope. Inside was a 1987 HOA membership agreement, with what looked exactly like my grandfather's signature, agreeing to full HOA authority forever. Proper notary seal, witnesses, the whole act. If it was real, my exempt cabin had been under HOA control for decades. The judge took one look and slapped a restraining order on me. No going within 500 feet of my own property until things were sorted. While I stood behind the tape line, Dylan toasted me from the porch with a beer and a middle finger. The thing is, I knew that document didn't smell right. Hank hated authority. The paper looked brand new, not 30-plus years old. And nobody in the neighborhood remembered him ever paying dues or attending meetings. Meanwhile, Elaine went all in on a smear campaign, telling anyone who would listen that I was stalking her, threatening her family, creeping around houses at night. She filed multiple police reports. To half the town, I suddenly looked like an unstable vet one bad day away from disaster. I hit my lowest point climbing into a dumpster behind the cabin. That's where I found it, a waterlogged box of Hank's papers, and in the middle, a folder stamped Official Correspondence, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Inside were letters from the 60s through the 90s on FBI letterhead, thank you notes, payment vouchers, meeting schedules for something called a civilian asset program. The cabin wasn't just his retreat. It was an off-site location for federal operations. One letter, dated 1987, the same year as that HOA agreement, thanked Henry Callahan for continued use of the property and confirmed it would retain federal protection status for operational security. I called the FBI field office, expecting to be laughed off. Instead, when I gave them the asset number from one of the vouchers, things got very quiet, very fast. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. Is this Henry Callahan's grandson? This is Special Agent Laura Kane. She remembered my grandfather. She remembered the cabin. And when I told her what Elaine had done, her voice dropped about 10 degrees. That property still has an inactive federal easement, she said. It was never terminated. If someone's messing with it, that's not just an HOA problem. She drove out the next day. In the meantime, Olivia kept piling up procedural violations against the HOA. Ethan Park, an investigative reporter who'd been chasing HOA corruption for years, heard veteran family plus FBI easement plus crooked HOA, and practically moved into Harper's Diner with his notebook. Veterans like Frank Doyle from the American Legion and Martha Green from the VFW Auxiliary started filing their own records requests. They found bogus fines targeting immigrant families, sham contracts funneling money to Elaine's relatives, and financial security upgrades paid to a company in Dylan's name that didn't exist outside a P.O. box. I did my part, cameras. Even with the restraining order, I could legally set up security cameras on the easement line, watching the property. Every violation notice Elaine posted, every time Dylan vandalized something, every shady visitor, recorded, timestamped, backed up. When Agent Kane came to the diner, she laid out Hank's files like evidence on a courtroom table, read for nearly an hour, then called someone from the parking lot, talking in short, precise sentences. When she came back in, she told me, "The Bureau is reopening interest in this property. We're investigating interference with a federal asset." Behind the scenes, it snowballed. The FBI ran surveillance and caught Dylan using the cabin as a base for drug deals, some of his customers already on federal watch lists. The county clerk turned over a recording of Elaine trying to bribe him to discover conveniently backdated HOA papers. The bottom-tier PI she'd hired, Vince Kovacs, was filmed on my cameras planting evidence in my trash. And then there was Mrs. Lee, an elderly widow who'd lost her own property to Elaine years earlier. She'd kept everything, fake assessments, threats, even recordings of Elaine bragging about targeting foreigners and military types because they don't know how to fight back properly. Her tub of documents, combined with my footage, the clerk's recording, the financial records, and the FBI's easement file, turned our collection of stories into a loaded cannon. The firing line was a town hall meeting. Officially, it was about the 4th of July budget. Unofficially, the whole town showed up because they'd heard something was about to explode. Mayor Thomas Collins opened the meeting, but Elaine rushed the mic, briefcase in hand, eyes blazing. She called me an unstable veteran. She called Hank a liar. She called the FBI letters fakes. She clicked through slides of blown-up documents and tried to spin my grandfather into some shady figure who'd probably been mixed up with the wrong people. That's when Mrs. Lee stood and asked, loud and clear, "Are you calling a Purple Heart veteran a traitor in front of his neighbors?" The room shifted. Veterans sat up a little straighter. Then Agent Laura Kane rose from her seat, badge on display. "I'm Special Agent Laura Kane with the FBI. I worked with Henry Callahan for 35 years. His cabin was used in national security operations. It carries an active federal easement. This HOA has zero authority over that land. Her voice was calm, but it landed like a hammer. We've also analyzed your so-called 1987 agreement. The paper was made in 2019. The ink is months old. The notary whose seal you used has been dead for decades. It's a forgery. You could feel the oxygen leave the room. Elaine actually stumbled away from the podium. And just so everyone's clear, Agent Kane added, your son, Dylan Rockwell, was arrested this afternoon for distributing controlled substances from that property. That was the cue. U.S. Marshals who'd been sitting quietly in the crowd stood up, moved forward, and put Elaine in cuffs right there in front of her kingdom. Fraud, embezzlement, interference with federal property, conspiracy, attempted bribery. The list was longer than her HOA rulebook. She screamed it was a setup. She threatened lawsuits. She said, I know people, as they walked her out. So did we. Within weeks, Elaine was facing federal charges and had lost her license. Dylan was in county jail, staring down strict probation and mandatory rehab. The HOA's insurance carrier rushed to settle. Other HOAs in the county rewrote their rules to add transparency and homeowner protections. The state legislature drafted a bill to protect residents from abusive HOAs, pushed by Ethan's investigative series. I used part of the settlement to create the Henry Callahan Memorial Fund, helping military families fight HOA harassment and supporting veteran housing projects. Once a month, veterans and neighbors gather at the cabin Hank built, drink coffee that somehow tastes better by the lake, and share war stories, combat ones and bureaucratic ones. Sometimes Agent Kane visits. We sit on the dock my grandfather hammered together, watching the light slide across Silver Mist Lake, and she reminds me that this quiet little place once helped take down people whose names we'll never hear on the news. The cabin is back where it belongs. The bullies got exposed. The community woke up. And Hank, the man who just wanted to be left alone, ended up protecting more people in death than most of us do while we're alive. So here's what I keep thinking and what I'll throw to you. When someone like Elaine hides behind bylaws, titles, and paperwork to crush families and call it just enforcing the rules, do we have any moral ground left if we stay silent for the sake of peace? Or is real justice only possible when ordinary people are willing to risk comfort, reputation, even safety to drag that kind of abuse into the light and finally say, enough?